the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. It was officially called the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and cost as much to build as the actual Louisiana Purchase cost to buy. It was a 1,200-acre ivory city of immense plaster palaces, breathtaking vistas, and extraordinary exhibits.
You couldn't possibly have seen even a fraction of the fair in one day. You really had to take weeks, months to be able to see everything.
Though we can no longer visit the fair, we can revisit it in a new book titled Prelude to a Century, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, written by St. Louis's own Patrick Murphy.
This was the biggest thing that ever happened in St. Louis. Everybody wanted a piece of it.
Throughout its 200 pages, Prelude to a Century is more than just a picture book about a long-ago event. It is a look into the minds of those who dared to dream it, worked to build it, and traveled to see it.
Every generation interprets the importance of the fair in its own way, because they're looking at it, through a different lens, a different perspective. It was amazing. It was an amazing event.
Patrick Murphy, thanks so much for being with us today. The book is great, and I have to tell you, I was a little skeptical at first when I heard there was a new World's Fair book out, because I thought to myself, what's new about the World's Fair that hasn't been written up in all the other books and documentaries? But you had all kinds of stuff in there I'd never heard before.
It was like going back to 1904 for me. You when you do the research, you spend a year going through thousands of photographs and documents. And I think people who do historical documents maybe are frustrated time travelers. At least I am. And you feel after a while that like you're really there. And then there's this wonderful service, newspapers.com. You can go back and find any newspaper article on any subject you want. And that gives you the feeling for what people were actually thinking about at the time, like that day. So you and I could go back to 1904, like this afternoon, and I'd be able to get you a trolley and an ice cream cone and be able to find my way around anywhere.
So you say you spent about a year researching it?
Yeah, and writing it about a year, and that's what we were looking for, the new stuff, the different things that people had never heard before. And the World's Fair, we're so fascinated with it. And that's interesting too. Like, why are we so fascinated with that? That was in my mind too. And part of the reason is because every generation interprets the importance of the fair in its own way, because they're looking at it, through a different lens, a different perspective.
Well, the fact that we're even still talking about it at all must say something.
Yeah, but it was amazing. It was an amazing event. And we're so used to hype in the way, this was the biggest, this is the best. It really was. And it's amazing to see how they put this together. 20 million people came to the fair. It was like 1,300 acres. It extended all the way up to Clayton Road on both sides of Skinker. It was gigantic.
Well, it was so big, apparently, I guess they had a railroad of their own that went around it?
They had one railroad, the intramural railroad, which went all the way around it in both directions. And then they had also little scenic railroads. And to look at a picture of this little railroad going up Skinker, which is a dirt road, and people on horses, you can't drive down Skinker again in your car and see it the same way.
Well, and also right in that spot there around Skinker, Oakland, I think there was the world's largest hotel at the time. It
was gigantic. It was called the Inside Inn, and sort of up near Clayton Road. And thousands of people, included the charge of admission for like $3.50 a night. But multiply all the prices by like 30, because that's the difference in inflation. So getting in for 50 cents sounds pretty good till you realize that it's actually a $15 ticket to get in. And you couldn't possibly have seen even a fraction of the fair in one day. You really had to take weeks, months to be able to see everything.
Nothing about it was really at human scale.
No.
It was gigantic, like palaces.
And that was the idea. David Francis and his friends, they were a little ticked off that they didn't get the Chicago Fair in 1893. It was still the same Cubs, Cardinals, Chicago, St. Louis thing even back then. And they wanted to get it for originally 1903, and then they pushed it back a year to 1904. But they needed to do something bigger than Chicago and better than Chicago. They wanted to do absolutely the biggest and best World's Fair that had ever been done.
Did you have any eureka moments when you were doing this research and found something you'd never heard of before?
Yeah, I found out where the axle to the Ferris wheel.
Oh, no, you didn't.
Yeah, I did. I did.
Where?
Well, you'd have to buy the book.
Do I have to get my metal detector out?
You'd have to buy the book and read the book.
People are still looking for it.
Well, they can keep on looking, but they're not going to find it in St. Louis.
I know, because I read the book.
But we're not going to tell them. They got to buy the book.
The secret.
Okay.
You got to buy the book.
Yeah.
I was amazed in looking at the book at the sharpness of the photos.
Yeah.
Have they done something to those pictures, AI or something, or?
No. I would clean some of them up if they had dust spots or things, and do a little Photoshop, or crop the part of the photo that was like totally destroyed. But a lot of the reasons those were so clear was because they were shot on glass plate negatives. And, the emulsion and the silver that they put on that is like the best possible kind of film. And, like big format cameras, sometimes you'll see in a picture of the photographers, and they're standing behind these giant boxes. And moving film, like they, with the big cranks, and it was one of the first major public events that really relied heavily on media to get the word out, and photography and motion pictures, which were brand new. They had a public relations department. They called it the Department of Exploitation. Figure that out. And they made sure that the word got out everywhere on every little thing that happened, and nothing bad would come out of except for the day on the New York Times. On the front page of the New York Times, they ran an article on how one cowboy shot another cowboy on the pike.
As part of a demonstration, or?
Because they were cowboys and they had a disagreement. And they decided to settle the disagreement over money, over drinks, which sounded like a good idea.
Not really when you're carrying a gun.
And right on the pike, which was the fun part.
Yeah.
The fun part.
It was like a mile long.
It was a mile long. It ran along the north side. That would be like along Forest Park Boulevard, from where Jefferson Memorial is now to Washington University. That was a mile long of just fun events and crazy things and camels and hoochie coochie girls. I think a lot of people went to the World's Fair saying they wanted to see the giant turbines, and they wanted to see the new telegraphy machine, but they really wanted to go down on the pike. People are people back then. And you ask about things that surprised me. It didn't surprise me as much as impressed me, how people are the same today as they are back then, except that people back then were more easily amazed. Nothing amazes us anymore. What could amaze us? But back then they were amazed at, you can get in a dirigible and go 1,000 feet in the air, and or they're actually sending Morse code without wires through the air. Automobiles, you can have a vehicle without a horse. Electricity. These things just blew people away. And the name of the book is Prelude to a Century. So one of the things that I wanted to do was get into the heads of people back then. Like, what did they think when they went to the fair? We think it's all kind of quaint and it was amazing and big, but we weren't amazed by telegraph machines or flying machines or automobiles or anything. But people back then in St. Louis, your typical person might have been an immigrant, might have come over from another country, lived in a cold water flat, lit by gas, traveled by trolley. It was a tough world back in St. Louis in 1904, with Irish and German neighborhoods and people trying to go through that transformation to becoming American. So when they go to the fair, they were just completely blown away. But then they came back home, to gaslight and wooden stoves and all of that. So it was it gave people a glimpse of what this new century was going to be like. And they got it kind of right, and they got it a lot wrong, too.
One of the things that caught my eye, you were talking about the photographers, is how much photography was being done by people attending the fair.
Yeah.
A shot in the book of the Kodak booth, I guess.
Kodakers.
get a camera. Were these brownies, I guess, or something?
Yeah.
The original. I didn't think of photography by the average citizen being that accessible. And I wonder what happened to all those pictures.
Well, they're in people's drawers and shoe boxes and, your basement, and grandma passed it on, and it's, there are a lot of snapshots, and there are a lot of them in the book too. But at the Chicago Fair, they forbid people from bringing cameras in because they were still, in 1893, they were still kind of big and wieldy and needed tripods. But by 1904, you could get a brownie for $1, which would be $30. And you could take your own pictures, snapshots, and all these new words like snapshot became invented, and there was a term called, I think, Kodak fiends. Kodak fiends. And people, how we talk today about people like on their cell phones. It seems so strange nowadays. People didn't used to always be on their cell phones. Back then they were saying, it's so weird seeing all these people looking into cameras and taking pictures.
Things don't change that much.
Yeah, but the whole idea of being able to make your own pictures, it's like people were as amazed by photography back then, I think, as we're amazed today by computers.
From the sublime to the ridiculous on the topic of cameras were these novelty cameras. I'll let you tell the story, but I'd never heard this, and apparently they were all the rage.
Yeah, it was. There was a fellow. He had this camera that it looked like a camera. I don't think it really took pictures, but it was the fabulous squirting camera. And the ad was so funny, too, because it would have hey, get the joke? Here's a gag. Hey, smile, take a picture. Whoop, now you're all wet. It was just so corny, because everybody was trying to make a buck off the fair, all the way from the guy who invented the squirting camera to Buster Brown shoes. 20 million people are going to pass the turnstiles. Every single one of them ought to at least know about Buster Brown shoes.
I thought it was really interesting in the book you go into alternative locations where they talked about having the fair. I never realized there had been alternative locations. Where else would you have it? But they had some kind of wacky ideas.
Yeah, you're probably referring to the idea of tearing down all the buildings on the riverfront, which they eventually did, and having the fair there. And some other architect said, let's not tear all the buildings down. Let's build a giant platform over what is now the arch grounds over the buildings, and we'll put the fair on top of it. Oh, there were all these crazy ideas that didn't get off the drawing board. One of them was a mercury fountain. Like,
that sounds healthy.
Yeah, a mercury. And it was supposed to squirt up a fountain of 200 feet in the air and sustain, balance a giant ball. And they found out, first of all, that it was toxic.
There's that.
Incredibly toxic. That there wasn't enough liquid mercury in the world to be able to build this fountain. But in a way, it sort of reflected the age. Anything is possible. If you can think of it, if you can imagine it, somehow it can be done. And, well, the fact was sometimes it couldn't be done too. But, that was the beginning of that mentality that we have today in the modern world of if you can imagine it, you can do it.
I saw the Liberty Bell at the fair.
Yeah.
They moved it?
Yeah, they did. And they they put it on a train. It was a big deal. The school children of St. Louis all donated nickels and dimes and pennies to bring the Liberty Bell. And that was a big deal because it was the 100th anniversary of Louisiana Purchase, 1903, 1904, 1803, 1804. And the idea of bringing the Liberty Bell kind of cemented the idea of westward expansion with the founding of the country. But it was funny, in one of the articles, they were talking about just how serious the Liberty Bell is. And the one reporter said, the Liberty Bell is one of the few things in the world that Americans are, he said, required to worship.
Among the many things I didn't realize that I'm, as a St. Louisan, sort of ashamed I didn't really realize, is that the River des Peres was actually part of a real river.
Yeah.
I just always thought it was a
sewer.
A sewer, or a stormwater canal, but there was a real river, and then the fair kind of brought it all together.
The River des Peres was this fun little river that just did its own thing, and you can see maps now of how it went through the area, which is Forest Park, and eventually, joins the Mississippi. But it was just uncontrollable. It was always flooding. And when it flooded, it could flood out hundreds of acres of Forest Park, which was no big deal when it was just a park. You could, go around it. But when it was a part of a fair, it was a disaster. So they built these underground culverts and put the river in the culverts. And in fact, I was over at the Missouri Historical Society in the course of doing this research. They said, yeah, and it runs right in front of the Missouri Historical Society. And on a rainy day, when you're in the elevator of Mohist, that you can actually hear the river through the wall.
Here's the story you told that I wish I would have known about before, back when I was reporting. There's this woman who was born who was named Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah.
I saw she didn't die till like 2003.
Yeah, she lived to be
How did we not interview her after all these years?
I didn't either. I never did either. She just lived a normal life in South St. Louis, and she's buried in a South St. Louis cemetery now. And her parents, the O'Learys, Mrs. O'Leary was like 16, and Mr. O'Leary was working on the grading of the roads and things, and they had a baby. This was about in 1902, I think it was, and they named it Louisiana Purchase O'Leary because they were so proud of this. And the newspapers picked up on it. It was a big deal, because this was the biggest thing that ever happened in St. Louis. Everybody wanted a piece of it.
I've always wondered, the buildings were essentially made of paper mache, right?
Yeah.
What happened when it rained?
It was strong enough to be able to, for a year. It was starting to look a little doggy after a year. But it's called staff, and it's paper mache. And when it hardens to like stone. It feels like stone. So you can chisel it, and you can make sculptures with it. You can make the outside of buildings with it. So it was a grade up from paper mache, just enough to keep it from melting in the rain. But it wouldn't have lasted forever. The Art Museum was the only building that was designed to be permanent.
And the gentleman had to wear coats in there. Right?
Coats and ties, yeah. David Francis said if you went into the art museum, you had to wear a coat and a tie.
Well, and speaking of art, the book includes some beautiful paintings that probably a lot of people haven't seen before, done by one particular painter that is
John
gorgeous.
Ross Key, who was the grandson of Francis Scott Key. And he painted these beautiful pictures, many of them which appeared in the Globe Democrat Sunday section. And St. Louisans, they'd cut them out of the newspaper and hang them on their walls. They were really beautiful, beautiful paintings.
Some of the fun things they had there that I saw in the book were roller chairs. Roller chairs.
Yeah.
You mean wheelchairs, or what are we talking about?
They were roller chairs pushed by roller boys who made about 18 cents an hour.
Were these for people who were infirmed or just too lazy to walk?
No, it was because even if you were in one palace, there could be like 6 miles of aisles to go through to be able to see the inside of the Palace of Machinery. Or if you wanted to get from the floral clock to the city of Jerusalem, it was a long haul. So you could either take one of the trains, or you could take one of the new horseless carriages, or you could essentially like a wheelchair, a roller boy would push. They got paid such lousy money that they went on strike. The Great Roller Boy Strike of 1904, and perhaps you've read about it in your studies of labor.
Sounds like it would be a good musical.
It poured down rain when they were going to go on strike. It just poured down rain, and nobody cared, and that was the end of their strike. They were also encouraged, in the ads, recruiting roller boys, who in a lot of cases were like college kids or people who'd just gotten out of high school, all boys, of course. They were encouraged in the advertisements to be the type of boy who does not flirt. They didn't want people rolling and flirting.
They had, and this is kind of mind-blowing, they had incubators there with babies.
Yeah. Incubators were a new thing, and they'd been in Coney Island, but they were designed to be entertaining rather than actually any kind of health center. And of course, the only people who really brought their babies were poor people who couldn't get their children into hospitals, and they sold the concession off to the same guy who did the Magic Whirlpool. So incubators, Magic Whirlpool, and it was basically done for money, and it eventually gotten straightened out, but not before a lot of babies actually died. And it was one of the grimmer aspects of the fair, and there were grim aspects of the fair.
Well, certainly the racial aspect of it with the various people, indigenous people that they brought in.
That was a tough one to deal with for me, because some people write, we talked about all the books that are written by the fair. Some people have decided that the theme of their book would be that the World's Fair is the worst thing that ever happened, that it was an expression of colonialism and racism and Jim Crow, and that they essentially, the Department of Anthropology there established human zoos. And that's true. I mean, it did happen. There was this new science, anthropology, and it was blatantly racist. It was that you could categorize people racially in terms of, at the very top, of course, are the Anglo-Saxons and the Teutons, the Teutonic people. And below that, there's a scale of people, and somewhere in there are the Irish and Italian and Jews and everything, and then and people of darker complexions. And yeah, it is a shameful part of the and then other people write books about how it was the most wonderful event, and they invented the ice cream cone and iced tea and all of these other things. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, that the fair reflected both the worst and the best of our instincts and knowledge at the time.
Fingerprinting owes its life, in a sense, to the World's Fair.
It was being developed by Scotland Yard at the time. Before fingerprinting, there was this method where they would measure your head and the distance between your eyes and be able to predict whether you were a criminal or not. But fingerprinting solved the problem. What if you have two guys who look almost exactly alike and the jury can't tell them apart? Fingerprints were the one thing that made everybody different. And so people were flocking to the Palace of Education to see the fingerprinting. And again, people were pretty easily amazed back then.
Did it become sort of popularized because of that with other police departments?
Yeah, well, the St. Louis Police Department was actually the first police department in America to actually institute fingerprinting as and then it caught on, and now everybody's got fingerprints.
Or hoof prints in the case of Jim Key.
Yeah. Beautiful Jim Key, the smartest horse in the world. And he was. I mean, Jim Key is still a mystery. This horse could sort mail and make coffee. I mean, it could do everything. But as amazing as he was his owner, who was formerly enslaved, freed after the Civil War, and the relationship between him and the horse. He didn't beat the horse as people did a lot back then, or they worked together almost as equals.
And father and son. I mean, the man's name was Key.
Yeah, with a lot of
the horse.
Compassion and understanding, and at the same time, it was a very new movement, the Be Kind to Animals movement, the ASPCA, protection of animals, and they went a long way through demonstrating how smart this horse was, that people should maybe look at animals a little differently.
Well, another movement that was sort of an offshoot of the fair was the City Beautiful movement, too.
Yeah, which actually I think even preceded the fair, because the Chicago Fair was this beautiful, ivory, white city. They called it the White City. And with, towers and Beaux Arts architecture. And the idea was, if you were to construct prettier cities, that people's spirits would elevate to where they would try to live up to the architecture. And that was a big movement, and the World's Fair was actually designed to be like the city of the future, where you would walk among the palaces and be inspired to be a better citizen. And the Civic Plaza downtown, around City Hall, although they came later in the 1920s and 30s, that was an element of this City Beautiful. I'm not sure it really inspired our souls to be better citizens or not, but it's more interesting to look at.
Well, St. Louis at least got some clean water out of it, because it was always brown until they realized it was going to be at the fair. And
up until a couple of weeks before they turned on the Cascades. One of the themes was fountains and the Cascades down Art Hill. But the problem was St. Louisans were real used to turning the tap water on and having brown stuff come out, mud. So they had to come up with a solution, because they were bringing people from all over the world. And can you imagine turning the Cascades on, and there's just mud in the air covering everything? So what they ended up doing was, they finally figured it out. A couple of weeks, they went up to the Chain of Rocks Bridge, and they dumped more lime than they ever thought would be needed to clean up the water, and it worked. And they turned on the fountains and just waited for like several days until the water finally reached St. Louis from Chain of Rocks, and they were very, very relieved to see clean water come out.
Well, they needed it for the iced tea.
The iced tea.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask the truth that you discovered. I don't know that you discovered it, but you have it in the book about iced tea, the ice cream cone, the hot dog.
Ice cream
what's
cone,
true and what's not with all of that?
Ice cream cone was invented at the World's Fair. Pretty much. I mean, like the hot dog, it becomes an issue of like, at what point is it an invention where you take a sausage and put it between two pieces of bread? Look what I invented.
The sandwich.
Yeah. So, I mean, the hot dog, yeah, maybe. But iced tea, definitely not. Definitely not. Iced tea was being served decades before, and there are records of it. But they popularized it, and that was a big deal, with instructions. Make tea, add ice. As I said, they were easily amazed.
So, what did you leave out? There must have been some stuff that you just didn't have room for that you would love to have gotten in there.
I think I pretty much got it all in. The next, I guess 20 years from now, somebody will write the next new book about the World's Fair. But no, I feel like, over the Ferris wheel, of course, that was a big deal. The Ferris wheel over near Skinker, the city of Jerusalem. I mean, I felt I could have gone further into some of these topics, but then I would have had to leave out, something else. The Ferris wheel was amazing. People wanted to get married on the Ferris wheel. And then, of course, the myth today of where's the axle?
Read the book.
Let's go digging.
Where can people find the book?
They're going to be able to find it, hopefully, everywhere. Bookstores, Amazon, even, Schnucks and Straub's and grocery stores even sell it. But it's going to be pretty much, anywhere you can get in wherever fine books are sold.
Well, this is a fine one.
Thank you.
It certainly is, and I think people will really enjoy it. It's a big book.
It is. It's heavy. They did a wonderful job. Reedy Press does a wonderful job of laying out, like the author, you write it and you get the pictures together and you write the captions, all that, and you send it to the publisher, and then they work with you to lay it out. And graphically they've done a really wonderful job.
I interviewed Bill McClellan a number of years ago about the difference between Chicago and St. Louis, not the fair, but just the towns themselves.
Yeah.
And he said that St. Louis was always like that old boxer in the corner that's talking about how great he used to be, And you sort of talk about that a little bit. You use the example of a photograph, but why do we keep going back to the fair?
We were the fourth biggest city in the country. We were growing. There was a sense of optimism. I think of the World's Fair as being like a photograph of yourself when you were young that you keep on the mantle, because you can always refer to it as evidence that at one time you were young and attractive and the whole world wanted to come and visit you. Things have changed since then, in St. Louis and a lot of other cities. But you can point to these pictures and this fair as evidence that at one time we were young and wonderful and full of possibilities.
Well, and the book is certainly a tribute to that. Prelude to a Century by Patrick Murphy. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.